Today we're hitting up section 1.2 titled The Elements of Life. Technically though, it's only like 7 that you have to know, and of which carbon is the most important. This video will largely correspond to chapter 4 of Chemical Biology, so let's do it. Hey guys, this is Mikey from Avo Prep Academy, and in today's video we're talking a bit about chemistry. Now, I know that many of you specifically chose to take AP Bio because chemistry is icky, but hear me out. Even though living systems are studied as a separate science from, say, subjects like chemistry and physics, we as biological beings formed and evolved on this planet, which is still part of this thing that we call a universe. And because chemistry and physics describe these laws and trends that we observe in this universe, it turns out that life is still constrained by these laws. So we do have to know a little bit about chemistry so that we can more comprehensively understand biological phenomena. So with that being said, let's lay out how we'll approach this section. First, we'll talk about some of the most common elements found in biological systems, discussing some important key points to know for your exam. And second, we'll specifically focus on carbon and gain a better understanding of how carbon's structure lends to its ability to act as the backbone of all macromolecules that we'll learn about in the next few units. Oh, and did you catch that? Carbon's structure is what results in its properties and function. See, this idea of this inseparable relationship between form and function will play a major role moving forward, so definitely keep that one in mind. And guys, before we move on, if what we're doing here is helpful to you, I'd really appreciate you guys clicking that like button and subscribing to our channel. It doesn't cost you a cent, and we really want to convince the YouTube algorithm that I'm actually getting more handsome with age. So thanks. So let's begin by talking about elements found within biology. Let's first establish that there are some 80 to 90 naturally occurring elements in our universe. These include common ones like hydrogen all the way to some rarer elements like platinum. At the beginning of the universe, these common elements like hydrogen and helium came into existence, so to say, but over time, through the birth and the eventual death of stars that we call supernovae, larger and larger elements would form and spread throughout our universe, eventually becoming part of planets like our own. It's so poetic, you know, that carbon in our bodies came from dying stars. Anyways, it's thought that life originated on our planet around 4 billion years ago, and as it would seem obvious to us now, life used resources that were readily available on this planet to form the first rudimentary molecules and components to make a cell. And these are the elements that are still found in organisms, so it's nice to know which ones they are. In this table, we see the most abundant elements within a human by relative mass. You can clearly see that oxygen, carbon, hydrogen, and nitrogen form some 96%. The reason oxygen and hydrogen seem to occupy so much real estate is the fact that we're mostly made of water. Considering that our cells are some 70 to 80% water, it makes sense that H2O would be mostly what makes up our bodies. Then we have carbon and nitrogen. But hold on to those for a moment because we'll talk a little bit more about them later. For now, let's take a look at the next line where we see a lot more elements. Things like calcium, phosphorus, magnesium. Yeah, they're all important if you've seen a vitamin bottle, but the one that I want you guys to focus on right now in this moment is sulfur, because that one will come in handy in the next unit. Now, we do have these trace elements that make up a tiny portion of our bodies. That being said, they're absolutely necessary. Iron, for example, is super important for carrying oxygen throughout our circulatory system, and iodine is really essential in normal thyroid function, so don't discount them just yet. What I think is super important for the purpose of this course, though, is the fact that this table of relative masses wouldn't really be that much different for any other organism out there. There's a message here that we should note. The reason that the elemental composition of most elements are so similar is that we all evolved from that common ancestor that I've sort of alluded to earlier. You know, the one from 4 billion years ago or so. And because this ancestral cell contains certain molecules to do the things that it needed to do, we inherited much of that blueprint as evolution took its course. As such, all living things connected by this singular lineage would have many similarities, of which this shared elemental composition is an important one. Okay, so that's enough about these NPC elements, so let's talk about carbon. Now, carbon has this massive main character energy on account of its presence in almost every macromolecule we study in this course. So what makes carbon so special? Let's begin by discussing carbon's atomic structure. Carbon has 6 protons and 6 electrons. Considering only 2 electrons can go into that first energy level, it naturally leads to a carbon atom having 4 valence electrons in its second energy level. Now, if you recall a bit of chemistry, then you might remember that each of these unpaired electrons could be used in a covalent bond. In fact, because there are only 4 of these slots that covalent bonds could form, carbon happens to have the maximum number of valence electrons possible for the formation of these covalent bonds. For instance, carbon could form a covalent bond here, 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 and here, while oxygen would only be able to form them here and here. This grants carbon an incredible ability to form a diverse array of molecules with unique structure, and therefore unique functions. Yep, I did it again. Structure and function. Very important. So let's see what all carbon can do. Carbons can form chains of varying lengths. They can have branching chains from these main chains forming 2 chains.
Watch out, little
They can also form double bonds, triple bonds, and even cyclical rings. Now, all of the molecules that you've seen here are called hydrocarbons, by the way, because they only contain hydrogen and carbon. And they're all non-polar, but that's not so important for right now. Just know that the structural diversity of carbon is why carbon is the most ideal element to form larger and larger molecules that we see in living systems. Great, now that we have the basics out of the way, let's focus on some specifics. Remember earlier how we saw carbons that have branched chains coming out of them? Let's take a look at one more. Here we see an image of pentane and a different looking molecule called 2-methylbutane. Alright, so different substances, different names. But wait, if you count the number of carbons and hydrogens in both of these molecules, they would both have 5 carbons and 12 hydrogens, or C5H12. So it turns out that if someone just said, hey, here's C5H12, you wouldn't actually know which one of these 2 substances that they were talking about. And in fact, because they're structured differently, they behave differently too. So in chemistry, this matters. So we call these different types of substances isomers, specifically structural isomers, with the word iso meaning same. It sort of makes sense. Same formula, different structures, and it matters for biology too. Because here we see another type of isomer, and it's very special. They're called enantiomers, which are mirror image molecules. The best way to think about this is seeing how your right hand and your left hand don't really superimpose on top of one another. I mean, try it. Now, in terms of biochemistry, this table shows why these enantiomers matter. Ibuprofen, which goes by the shelf title of Advil, is an anti-inflammatory. But with ibuprofen, only the left or the S-ibuprofen is the effective one, while the right one is not. On the other hand, albuterol is effective in its right form, but not the left one. And if anyone asks why this is the case, then all you have to say is something like this. Because left and right-handed molecules differ in their structures, their interactions with biological receptors, proteins, and so on would not occur normally. It would be like opening a lock with a key that had been cut in its mirror image. Simple enough, right? Well, you'll probably end up writing something like that in the May exam. Okay, so now in this chapter, there is yet one more section that annoys everyone. And it's on something called functional groups. But you're in luck, because I made a whole separate video that covers these functional groups and exactly why you need to know each and every one of them for this course specifically. So I'll put up a link like here or here, and also include it in the description below, so be sure to check out that video too. It's literally like my worst performing video for some reason. Anyways, I think that should do it for today. Thanks for tuning in. And if you've made it this far, it must mean that this video must have vibed with you. And maybe it'll vibe with a friend too. So share, like, subscribe, do all that YouTube stuff, and we'll see you in the next video. This has been Mikey, brought to you by Avo Media.